Janet Ann Taylor. On the evening of March 24, 1974, Janet Ann Taylor, 21 years old, left a friend's house in Palo Alto to hitchhike home to La Honda, California. She was a sophomore at Cañada College, studying hard and working toward her future. She was also the daughter of Chuck Taylor, Stanford University's legendary football coach and athletic director, a prominent figure in Bay Area sports. The spunky, fun-loving young woman never made it home that night. The next morning, a truck driver discovered her body in a roadside ditch on Sand Hill Road near Manzanita Way in Woodside. She had been beaten and strangled in what investigators described as a sexually motivated attack, though she had not been violated in that manner. The location wasn't far from Stanford's campus. From the beginning, detectives believed her case was connected to the December 1973 ending of Leslie Perlov, who was found strangled under remarkably similar circumstances near Stanford. DNA evidence was collected from Taylor's clothing and carefully preserved by investigators who hoped future technology might help solve the case. But in 1974, the science to analyze DNA simply didn't exist yet. The structure of DNA had only been discovered 2 decades earlier, and the technology to use it for identification was still years away from development. When DNA testing finally became available in later decades, the profile generated from that preserved evidence was entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system that law enforcement agencies use to match criminal DNA profiles across jurisdictions. Investigators waited hopefully for a match to appear. None ever did. The case file was eventually shelved as leads dried up completely, leaving Taylor's family without answers for nearly half a century. In 2017, the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office reopened the case and partnered with Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company specializing in a revolutionary new approach. Using investigative genetic genealogy, genealogist C.C. Moore analyzed DNA from both the Taylor and Perlov cases. This technique traces DNA through distant relatives in public genealogy databases like GED Match, eventually narrowing suspects through meticulous family tree construction, a method that didn't exist when the cases first went cold. The analysis pointed to John Arthur Gautreau, a 74-year-old Hayward resident who had worked as a cardiology technician at Stanford Hospital during the 1970s. He had been in the right place at the right time for both offenses. Detectives began following Gautreau and collected a coffee cup he discarded near his home. The DNA from that cup matched evidence from Taylor's clothing with scientific certainty. What investigators uncovered about Gautreau's background was deeply disturbing and revealed a pattern spanning decades. In 1963, a full decade before Taylor's ending, he had been convicted of taking the life of a 15-year-old in Germany while serving in the U.S. Army. He served time for that offense overseas. After his release, he returned to California and resumed his life. In 1975, just 1 year after Taylor was ended, he was convicted of forcing himself on a 17-year-old explorer scout in Palo Alto. He served 8 years for that offense, then was released back into society, where he lived quietly for decades. Gautreau was charged with Taylor's ending in May 2019 while already in custody for the Perlov case. In September 2021, a San Mateo County jury deliberated just 1 hour before convicting him of first-degree offense. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match, his proximity to both cases, his documented history of harming women, and the similarities between the 2 Stanford area strangulations. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. On April 27, 2023, Gautreau pleaded guilty to the Perlov ending as well and received a consecutive life sentence. 5 months later, on September 22, 2023, He passed away in state prison at 79 years old at the California healthcare facility. Ending any possibility of further prosecution for additional offenses, investigators believe he may have committed during his decades of freedom between convictions. The case that had been cold for 47 years was solved through a discarded coffee cup and the determination of investigators who refused to let technology limitations from 1974 be the final word. Janet Taylor's family finally got answers about what happened to their spunky, fun-loving daughter on that March night. Though the man who took her life escaped full earthly accountability by passing away in prison before serving significant time for her ending specifically. While that case involved a serial predator who operated across decades and jurisdictions. The next victim was taken from a neighborhood where she should have been completely safe. Minor Liz Minnie Soriano. Minor Liz Minnie Soriano was a 13-year-old straight-A student in the Bronx who disappeared while walking home from school on February 24, 1999. The 7th grader at Intermediate School 127 was responsible far beyond her years. She ran errands for her family, did laundry, and cared for her younger sister, Nadia. She dreamed of becoming an astronaut and wrote poetry in her journal, expressing her hopes for the future. When Minnie's younger sister arrived home alone that afternoon, the family knew immediately something was terribly wrong. Minnie would never have let her little sister walk home by herself. She took her responsibilities seriously and was protective of her sibling. 4 days later, a homeless man found Minnie's body in a dumpster behind a video store at 2098 Bartow Avenue in Co-op City, approximately 2 miles from her home. She had been strangled, her body bound with green gaffer's tape and wrapped in garbage bags, then discarded like trash. The NYPD formed a massive task force with dozens of detectives assigned full-time to find who did this to a 7th grader. They canvassed the entire area door to door, interviewed every male resident in Minnie's apartment building, and collected DNA samples from over a dozen potential suspects who had any connection to the victim or the area. Biological evidence found on her sweatshirt was sent to the FBI lab at Quantico for the most advanced analysis available at the time. Despite these extensive and thorough efforts involving hundreds of man-hours, no match emerged from DNA databases, and the case went cold as leads dried up. In February 2018, the NYPD Bronx Homicide Squad reopened the case with fresh eyes and new technology. Detective Malcolm Ryman submitted the DNA evidence for familial DNA testing, a relatively new technique that searches databases for partial matches to relatives of the actual perpetrator rather than requiring an exact match to the person themselves. This approach had been used successfully in other states, but was still relatively new to New York City investigations. In June 2020, state officials called with a breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. The DNA partially matched a deceased man in the database who had prior convictions on his record. Detectives built a detailed family tree from that partial match, carefully narrowing suspects from dozens of relatives down to 5 people, then 3. Their target finally emerged: Joseph Martinez, known on New York streets as Jupiter Joe, a street astronomer who taught people about the stars using a telescope on sidewalks and subway platforms throughout the city. He seemed harmless, even helpful to the community. An NYPD detective posed as a mother seeking an astronomy lesson for her family and met Martinez at a New Rochelle diner for what appeared to be a normal meeting. After their pleasant conversation about the stars and planets, investigators retrieved a straw he used during the meal. The DNA from that straw matched the evidence from 1999 exactly. Not a partial match, but a complete match with astronomical odds against it being anyone else. Martinez, 49 years old at the time of his arrest, was taken into custody on November 29, 2021. His case became the first in New York City history to use familial DNA technology at trial, a significant legal milestone that would set precedent for future cases across the city and potentially the entire state. During the month-long trial in Bronx Supreme Court, jurors heard testimony that Martinez lived in the same apartment building as Minnie and her family. He had told detectives back in the original 1999 investigation that he remembered her selling candy door to door in the building to raise money for school activities, but was never developed as a suspect without the DNA technology to connect him definitively to the physical evidence. On November 14, 2025, the jury found Martinez guilty of 2 counts of second-degree ending. He faces up to 25 years to life in prison when sentenced. His sentencing is scheduled for January 8, 2026, just weeks away as you're hearing or reading this. Bronx District Attorney Darcel D. Clark stated, "Bronx detectives and my assistant district attorneys never gave up in the quest to hold accountable the person responsible for what happened to this beautiful young person. The straight-A student who dreamed of becoming an astronaut finally got justice after 26 years. The case that had been cold for over 2 decades was solved through familial DNA, a technique that wouldn't have been available to the original investigators in 1999. Jupiter Joe, the friendly street astronomer who taught people about the cosmos, had been hiding a terrible secret for 22 years, living in the same community as the family whose daughter he'd taken. While that case was solved through familial DNA matching relatives in a database, the next involved a different kind of genetic detective work and an old razor. Jane Antunes. Jane Caroline Morton. Antunes was 30 years old when she disappeared on November 17, 1977, from Atascadero, California. She had recently divorced after a marriage that didn't work out and moved back in with her parents while she got back on her feet. On that evening, around 7:30 p.m., she left home in her gold 1972 Datsun to visit her best friend who lived nearby. She told her parents she'd be back soon. She never arrived at her friend's house. The next afternoon, her older brother grew concerned when no one had heard from Jane. He went looking for her and found her car parked on a dirt road off Santa Barbara Road, approximately 1 mile from her parents' home. Jane's body was in the back seat. Her throat had been cut, and her arms were bound behind her back with what appeared to be her own clothing. The scene indicated she had been overpowered and taken from wherever she'd been intercepted on her way to her friends. Investigators worked the case hard in the days and weeks following the discovery. They learned that Arthur Rudy Martinez, recently paroled to San Luis Obispo County, worked at a local welding shop in the area. His name came up during the investigation as someone to look at closely. He was on their radar as a person of interest, but without DNA technology available in 1977, they couldn't connect him directly to the offense. When leads dried up and the case went cold, Martinez left California in January 1978 for Spokane, Washington. In Washington state, Martinez continued his pattern of harming others in the community. He committed numerous robberies throughout the area and 2 additional serious offenses against women. He was caught, prosecuted, and sentenced to life in prison in Washington in November 1978, just 1 year after Jane Antunes's ending. He would spend decades behind bars in Washington for those offenses, never knowing that California investigators still had evidence that could connect him to Jane. In 1994, showing the audacity that characterized his criminal career, Martinez escaped from prison and lived under an assumed name in the Fresno area for 20 years. He managed to evade detection for 2 full decades, building a completely new life under a false identity while remaining a fugitive from justice. He finally turned himself in on April 30th, 2014, after being diagnosed with terminal cancer and knowing his time was limited. He passed away in prison on June 18, 2014, never having faced charges for what happened to Jane Antunez or knowing that technology would eventually link him to her ending. In 2017, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation into Jane's case as part of a broader effort to solve older cases using new techniques. In March 2018, submitted DNA evidence to California's Familial DNA Search Team, hoping the technique that had worked in other cases might help. The search found a close match to an inmate whose relative, Martinez, had lived in Atascadero during the exact time frame of the offense. Detectives tracked down Martinez's former girlfriend from the 1970s, hoping she might have something that could confirm the familial match. She still had his old razor stored away after all these years, kept in a box with other old belongings. On April 8, 2019, the Department of Justice Lab confirmed the razor's DNA matched evidence from the 1977 scene with certainty. Even more remarkable, a witness who had seen a man near the scene in 1977 was shown Martinez's photo 41 years later and immediately identified him as the person they'd seen that day. On April 17, 2019, Sheriff Ian Parkinson announced the case was solved. Because Martinez had passed away in 2014, 5 years before being identified, he was never arrested or prosecuted for Jane's ending. He was also identified as responsible for ending Patricia Dwyer in January 1978. Another case that had remained unsolved for over 4 decades. The families of both women received answers, but no formal legal justice. There would be no trial, no conviction, no sentencing, no opportunity to face the man who took their loved ones. Martinez had escaped earthly accountability by passing away before being identified. But at least the families knew the truth, after 42 years of wondering who had taken their loved ones and why the cases had never been solved despite extensive investigation. The razor, an everyday object his girlfriend had kept for decades in a box without knowing its significance, became the key piece of evidence that finally brought closure to 2 families who had waited over 4 decades for answers about what happened. While Martinez escaped prosecution through his own passing before identification. The next case involves someone arrested, but now facing serious legal challenges that threaten the entire prosecution. Tracy Gilpin. Tracy L. Gilpin attended a neighborhood party in Rocky Nook, Kingston, Massachusetts on October 1, 1986, after finishing a babysitting job earlier that evening. Around 10:30 p.m., she left the party to walk home with a group of friends for safety. They walked together for a while. Then Tracy continued alone to buy cigarettes at Cumberland Farms convenience store on Route 3A, a normal stop for her. She was last seen in the store's parking lot around 11:30 p.m. after using the payphone to call home and let her family know she was on her way. 3 weeks later, on October 22, 1986, a woman picking flowers in Miles Standish State Forest discovered Tracy's badly decomposed body in a makeshift grave that had been dug in a remote area. She had been struck with a 73 to 74-pound boulder that was found on her head, causing a massive skull fracture. Her clothing was disturbed in ways that indicated an attack had occurred, and some items were missing from the scene entirely. Kingston police initially classified Tracy as a runaway due to her history of leaving home in the past, which delayed the investigation's start by precious days and possibly weeks. Evidence degraded significantly during the 3 weeks her body lay undiscovered in the forest before being found. One early suspect, a man later convicted of ending another teenager in a different case, was investigated thoroughly but ruled out through alibi verification and other evidence that cleared him. In 2017, the Gilpin family raised the reward to $25,000. generating new tips from the community after decades of silence. One anonymous tipster came forward and named Michael Hand, saying Tracy had been seen at his house the night she disappeared. This tip, coming over 3 decades after the offense, reignited the investigation with new energy. Massachusetts State Police traveled to Troutman, North Carolina, in March 2018 to interview Hand about events from 3 decades earlier. During the interview on March 7, 2018, he provided statements placing himself at the scene where Tracy was found and admitted to actions that resulted in her passing. He also made incriminating statements to his pastor about what had happened 3 decades earlier, seeming to seek some form of spiritual absolution. Hand was arrested on March 9, 2018, at 61 years old and held without bail. But the case has faced serious challenges in Massachusetts courts. In August 2022, Superior Court Judge Brian Davis ruled portions of Hand's police interview were coerced and suppressed those statements from being used at trial, finding investigators had crossed lines during the interrogation. The judge also ruled his statements to his pastor inadmissible under religious privilege protections that shield confessions made in a spiritual context. Most significantly, in October 2024, the Massachusetts Appeals Court upheld the suppression decisions and noted in a footnote that DNA found on Tracy Gilpin did not match Michael Hand's DNA. This revelation cast serious doubt on the entire case against him and raised troubling questions about whether he actually committed the offense or had falsely confessed for unknown reasons. Hand, now 67, has been held without bail since March 2018, nearly 7 years, but has not been tried yet for Tracy's ending. His defense attorney stated they are looking forward to clearing his name, given the DNA evidence that excludes him as the biological source. The prosecution is weighing their options carefully, but the case remains in serious legal jeopardy with no trial date set and growing doubt about conviction prospects. The suppression of his statements combined with DNA evidence that doesn't match him has created a situation where conviction seems highly unlikely if the case proceeds to trial. The question now is whether prosecutors will proceed with what limited evidence remains, or whether they'll be forced to dismiss charges and acknowledge they may have arrested the wrong person based on a false or coerced confession. Tracy Gilpin's family has been waiting since 1986 for justice and closure. They thought they finally had it when Hand was arrested in 2018 with his apparent confession. But the case has unraveled in the courts over the past several years, and significant doubt exists about whether Michael Hand actually did what he initially said he did. The real perpetrator may still be out there, unidentified and free after nearly 4 decades. While that case shows how investigations can go terribly wrong even decades later, with modern technology, the next demonstrates how advances in DNA extraction finally identified the right person after 28 years. Danielle Houchins. Danielle "Danny" Houchins left her Belgrade, Montana home around 11 a.m. on September 21, 1996, heading to Cameron Bridge fishing access site on the Gallatin River after a family disagreement that morning. She wanted to get away and think things through. She was wearing a knee brace from a recent incident at a street dance that had injured her leg. When Danny didn't return by evening as expected, her mother and a friend grew concerned and drove to the fishing site to look for her. They found her unlocked truck sitting in the parking lot, with keys still in the ignition and a water bottle lying on the trail leading from the vehicle toward the river. 2 volunteer searchers who had been called to help discovered her body around 9:30 p.m., face down in shallow water under a willow tree, partially hidden from view by vegetation. The coroner ruled Danny's passing was caused by drowning, suffocating in the shallow marsh water where she was found. But evidence at the scene suggested something else had happened before the drowning. A laceration on her body indicated an attack had occurred. Biological evidence was found on her clothing that didn't belong to her. Her body appeared to have been dragged under the willow tree rather than having gotten there on its own. Her watch was pulled partway off her hand in a way that suggested a struggle. Controversially, despite all this evidence, the manner of ending was listed as undetermined rather than homicide. The sheriff at the time publicly suggested in media interviews that it could have been an accident, that perhaps she had fallen and hit her head, then drowned in the shallow water. Former deputies later criticized this assessment as not pursuing the case aggressively enough and giving up too easily. The case languished without resolution for nearly 3 decades. In 2021, Sheriff Dan Springer decided to bring in outside experts with fresh perspectives, including retired Shawshai LAPD Captain Tom Elfmont as a private investigator. 4 rootless hairs from Danny's body were sent to Estria Forensics in California, which had developed advanced techniques for building DNA profiles from challenging sample types. Rootless hairs typically don't contain sufficient genetic material for testing because the DNA is in the root, but advances in technology made extraction possible. Parabon Nanolabs then traced the DNA through genetic genealogy, with renowned genealogist C.C. Moore working to connect it to all 4 grandparents of Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson, a 55-year-old Bureau of Land Management employee living in Dillon, Montana, not far from where Danny had been found 28 years earlier. On July 23, 2024, investigators traveled to Dillon and interviewed Hutchinson outside his workplace, where he'd been employed for years. During the nearly 2-hour conversation, he turned white, sweated profusely, and slumped in his chair when shown Danny's photo and asked where he was on September 21, 1996. He denied involvement repeatedly, but his physical reactions told investigators they had found the right person. His body language and responses didn't match his words. Approximately 10 hours after the interview concluded and investigators left to seek a search warrant, Hutchinson called 911. Responders found him deceased from a self-inflicted wound. Rather than face accountability for what he'd done to Danny 28 years earlier, he chose to end his own life that evening. DNA collected during Hutchinson's autopsy provided 100% confirmation he was Danny's attacker. There was no doubt whatsoever. The case was officially closed on August 8, 2024. Danny's sister Stephanie stated, when the time came to face up and account for his actions, he instead chose to end his life, robbing the family of the chance to see him face justice in court. Law enforcement continues to investigate Hutchinson's background for possible connections to other unsolved offenses in the Montana and Idaho region. As a Bureau of Land Management employee with access to remote areas and knowledge of the terrain, he might have had opportunities to harm others that haven't been connected to him yet. The case that was misclassified as undetermined for 28 years was finally solved through rootless hair analysis, technology that didn't exist when Danny's body was found in 1996. Her family got answers about what really happened, though the person responsible escaped earthly justice through his own actions hours after being confronted. While Hutchinson took his own life when confronted by investigators, the next case involves multiple victims and a perpetrator identified years after his own passing in prison. Lynn Vest and Jeremy Pickens. Lynn Hokuli Vest was 23 years old, the daughter of a Columbus Police Department robbery detective who had spent his career trying to bring criminals to justice. On November 12, 1980, Lynn was babysitting her 2.5-year-old nephew Jeremy Pickens while his mother worked. The pair left home together to run some errands and were last seen by witnesses at Hamilton and Main Streets in Whitehall, Ohio in the late afternoon. The next morning, a delivery driver discovered Lynn's blue 1979 Ford Mustang Cobra parked on Kelton Street, approximately 4 miles from where they'd last been seen the previous day. Inside the trunk, wrapped carefully in a sheet, were the bodies of Lynn and Jeremy. Lynn had been strangled with significant force. Jeremy, just a toddler, had been suffocated. The perpetrator had methodically wiped the car clean of fingerprints, showing planning and awareness of forensic investigation techniques. Lynn's credit card, cash, wedding ring, purse, and a keychain bearing her name were all missing from the vehicle. Multiple independent witnesses came forward describing 2 individuals in a white car following Vest's distinctive Mustang before the abduction occurred. One witness specifically saw a man exit the Mustang at one point and get into a waiting white car, suggesting coordination between at least 2 people working together. 20 homicide detectives were assigned to the case full-time, making it one of the largest investigations in Columbus history. But DNA technology didn't exist in 1980 to help identify suspects from biological evidence. When DNA testing became available years later, a profile was developed from evidence collected from Lynn during the original investigation and entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Investigators hoped for a match to appear that would crack the case. No matches were found in the database for decades, despite the profile being run repeatedly. And the case remained frustratingly cold despite the extensive initial investigation and all the witnesses who had come forward. In 2025, advances in technology allowed investigators to do something previously impossible. They were able to extract DNA from rootless hair found in the vehicle, a type of evidence that couldn't be tested for decades because the genetic material in hair without roots is so limited. Investigative genetic genealogist Amanda Reno traced the DNA through painstaking family tree construction and public genealogy databases to Charles William Elliott, a career criminal who had passed away in prison in 2000 while serving time for another conviction unrelated to Lynn and Jeremy. Elliott's remains were exhumed in fall 2025 from wherever he'd been buried after his prison passing, and DNA testing confirmed the match definitively. There was no doubt whatsoever. Columbus Police announced the identification on January 23, 2026, just days ago as you're hearing or reading this, making it one of the most recent cold case solves in the country. The case remains technically open because evidence suggests Elliott may not have acted alone, consistent with eyewitness accounts of 2 suspects working together in coordination. Police continue seeking information about a possible second perpetrator who may still be alive and has escaped accountability for 45 years. Jeremy's mother, Cheryl Button, who was working when her sister and son were taken, stated, "There's always hope. It's been 45 years for us. The family finally knows who took Lynn and Jeremy from them, even though Charles Elliott passed away in prison a quarter-century ago without ever being charged for what happened in November 1980. He had been serving time for other offenses, never knowing that technology would eventually link him to this double ending. The rootless hair, evidence that couldn't be tested for 4 decades, became the key to solving a case that had frustrated investigators since 1980. Modern technology extracted answers from evidence that had been sitting in storage for 45 years, waiting patiently for science to catch up to what investigators needed. While Elliott was identified posthumously through advanced DNA extraction, the next case involves someone who was caught because of evidence she left literally embedded in the victim's flesh. Sherry Rasmussen. Sherry Ray Rasmussen was 29 years old, the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center with a master's degree from UCLA. She was accomplished, intelligent, and had worked hard to build her career in healthcare. On February 24, 1986, she stayed home from work with a back problem at her Van Nuys, Los Angeles condominium that she shared with her husband. Her husband, John Ruetten, left for work around 7:20 a.m., kissing her goodbye and expecting to see her that evening. That evening, Ruetten returned home from work to find broken glass scattered across the driveway and his wife deceased on the living room floor inside their home. She had been beaten severely and struck 3 times with a firearm. The scene showed unmistakable signs of a violent struggle that had raged throughout the condo: a broken vase, overturned furniture, items knocked off shelves, and a bloody handprint near the burglar alarm panel. A bite mark was clearly visible on her arm, preserved in her flesh. LAPD. Detectives who responded concluded Sherry was ended during a botched burglary. Someone had broken in expecting an empty house and panicked when they encountered her. But Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, repeatedly urged police to investigate a different theory. He wanted them to look at Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer who was Ruetten's ex-girlfriend and had confronted and threatened Sherry multiple times before the wedding. Detective Lyle Mayer dismissed the concerned father, telling him he watched too much television and that a police officer couldn't possibly be involved in something like this. What investigators didn't know at the time: Lazarus owned a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson firearm that she reported stolen 13 days after Sherry's ending. Suspicious timing that should have raised red flags. She had continued pursuing Ruetten romantically, even after his engagement to Sherry, even having relations with him, one final time after he was already committed to marrying someone else. Her personal diary entries showed depression and anger over losing him to another woman. In 2004, 18 years after the ending, criminalist Jennifer Francis analyzed the bite mark swab that had been preserved in a freezer since 1986. DNA testing technology had advanced enough to analyze it. The results revealed the perpetrator was female, completely undermining the burglary theory that had dominated the case for nearly 2 decades. When Francis asked about the third-party female mentioned in the file who had harassed the victim before her passing, a supervising detective responded, "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective?" and said she was not a part of this investigation. The case went back into files until March 2008, when Detective Jim Nuttall found the file sitting near his desk and started reading through it. He and partner Pete Barba developed a list of 5 female suspects and were shocked to discover one was an active LAPD detective still working cases. They investigated secretly for months, referring to Lazarus only as number 5 in their notes to avoid tipping her off that she was under investigation. In 2009, detectives covertly collected a cup Lazarus discarded at a Costco where she'd stopped during her day. The DNA matched the bite mark perfectly with astronomical odds. She was arrested at LAPD headquarters on June 5, 2009, 23 years after Sherry's ending, while sitting at her desk working cases. Lazarus, then 49, was tried in 2012 and convicted of first-degree offense after the jury heard all the evidence. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. At her first parole hearing in November 2023, Lazarus confessed for the first time, stating, "It makes me sick to this day that I took an oath to protect and serve people. And I took Sherry Rasmussen's life." A panel initially recommended parole, but California Governor Gavin Newsom ordered a full review of the recommendation. On February 12, 2025, just weeks ago, parole was denied again. Commissioner Kevin Chappell stated her testimony does not match up with the evidence used to convict you, suggesting she's still not being fully truthful about what happened. She remains incarcerated at California Institution for Women in Corona. Her next parole eligibility hearing is scheduled for 2028. Nels Rasmussen, who championed the investigation for decades after police initially dismissed him as watching too much television, passed away in 2020 without seeing Lazarus denied parole. But he recorded a video for future parole hearings that continues to speak powerfully for his daughter at every hearing, ensuring Sherry's voice is never forgotten. The bite mark, evidence collected in 1986 and frozen for 18 years before technology could analyze it, became the key to convicting a police detective who thought she'd gotten away with ending her romantic rival. She had investigated crimes while hiding her own for over 2 decades. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While Sherry's case involved someone hiding in plain sight within law enforcement, the next victim was celebrating her birthday when tragedy struck. Jessica Bagin. Jessica Bagin celebrated her 17th birthday with family and friends in Sitka, Alaska, on May 3, 1996. The next morning, around midnight on May 4th, she began walking the approximately 1-mile journey home from her sister's residence along a bike path near Sheldon Jackson College. It was a route she'd walked many times before and felt completely safe, taking even at night in their small Alaska community. She never arrived home that night. On May 6, 1996, searchers found her body approximately 70 feet off the path, discarded and hastily buried in a hollowed-out area beneath the trunk of a large fallen tree. She had been strangled, and evidence indicated she'd been attacked on or near the path she was walking. 9 days after Jessica was found, Richard Bingham confessed to her ending. Despite his confession to police, physical evidence didn't connect him to the offense in any way. At trial in early 1997, he was found not guilty on all charges by a jury that didn't believe his confession was credible. Over the years that followed, more than 100 potential suspects were cleared through DNA comparison testing, but no matches ever appeared. In 2018, investigators began exploring genetic genealogy, the revolutionary technique that was just starting to solve cold cases across the country. By 2019, a SNP DNA profile was uploaded to public databases, including GED Match, where distant relatives' DNA could help identify suspects. Genealogist Patty Busby of the Alaska Department of Public Safety traced the DNA through family trees to Steve Allen Branch, a 66-year-old former Sitka resident who had moved to Austin, Arkansas. What made Branch particularly significant was his history. He had actually been investigated by Sitka PD in March 1996, just weeks before Jessica's ending, for a serious offense against another teenage female in the area. He was tried for that offense in 1997 and acquitted by a jury, similar to Bingham's outcome. Branch had been on investigators' radar decades earlier, but without the DNA technology to connect him definitively. On August 3, 2020, Alaska Bureau of Investigation agents traveled from Alaska to Arkansas and confronted Branch at his home. He denied involvement in Jessica's ending and refused to provide a DNA sample for comparison. Investigators left to obtain a search warrant that would compel him to provide DNA. Approximately 30 minutes after the agents left his property, Branch took his own life with a firearm. DNA obtained during his autopsy matched the crime scene evidence from 1996 with scientific certainty. The case was closed by exception on August 11, 2020. Commissioner Amanda Price stated, "While Branch will never face a jury of his peers in this case, we can finally say that Jessica's case is solved." Richard Bingham, who was acquitted in 1997, but never fully exonerated in the public eye, was finally and completely cleared. He had lived for over 2 decades under a cloud of suspicion, despite his not guilty verdict. The real perpetrator had been Steve Branch all along. someone who had been investigated just weeks before Jessica's ending for harming another teenager in the same community. Jessica's family waited 24 years for answers. They got them when Branch's DNA confirmed his guilt. Though he escaped earthly justice by taking his own life rather than face accountability for what he'd done to a teenager who was just walking home from her sister's house after celebrating her birthday. The genetic genealogy that identified Branch, tracing his DNA through distant cousins and building family trees, was the same technique being used to solve cold cases across the country. Alaska had joined the growing list of states using this revolutionary approach to finally bring closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. While Branch's case ended with his suicide, the next involves someone who inserted himself into an investigation for decades before finally being caught. Jonelle Matthews. Jonelle Renee Matthews was adopted at 6 weeks old by Jim and Gloria Matthews in Greeley, Colorado. On December 20th, 1984, she performed in a Christmas concert with her middle school choir, a joyful evening of holiday music. A friend's father dropped her at home at 8:15 p.m. after the concert. At 8:30 p.m., she answered a phone call and took a message for her father, who was at another event. When Jim Matthews returned from his other daughter's basketball game at 9:30 p.m., the house was empty, television and lights still on, garage door standing open. Footprints in the snow outside windows showed someone had been looking into the house. Snow had been raked to cover tracks near the house, attempting to hide evidence. Jonelle became one of the first milk carton kids, with her photo distributed nationwide on milk cartons to help find her. President Ronald Reagan mentioned her in a 1985 speech about missing persons. The case generated thousands of leads over the following decades, but no solid evidence of what happened. Jonelle was declared legally deceased in 1994 after 10 years without any trace. The family never stopped searching or hoping for answers. On July 23, 2019, construction workers installing an oil pipeline discovered human remains 15 miles southeast of Jonelle's former home in a remote area. The cause of passing: gunshot wound to the head. After 35 years, Jonelle was finally found. Unlike most cold cases resolved through DNA, this case was solved through circumstantial evidence and the suspect's own incriminating statements over decades. Stephen Dana Pankey, a former youth pastor at the church the Matthews family attended, had been excommunicated from that church in 1978, 6 years before Jonelle's disappearance. He had inserted himself into the investigation repeatedly over the years, volunteering information to police without being asked. Critically, he knew details that had been withheld from the public, including that a rake was used to cover footprints in the snow at the Matthews home. How would he know that unless he was there? He repeatedly requested immunity in exchange for information over the decades, suggesting he had knowledge he was afraid to share without legal protection. Pankey had lived approximately 2 miles from the Matthews home in 1984. Detective Mike Prill stated Pankey held a vendetta against the church that excommunicated him years earlier. Pankey also held racist ideologies, according to investigators, and Jonelle was Latino, a detail that may have factored into his targeting of the Matthews family. Pankey was arrested on October 12, 2020, in Twin Falls, Idaho, where he had run for governor twice in recent years. His first trial in October 2021 ended in a mistrial, with a hung jury unable to reach unanimous verdict. At his retrial in October 2022, he was found guilty of felony offense and second-degree kidnapping with a deadly weapon, but not guilty of first-degree offense. The jury believed he was responsible, but couldn't prove premeditation beyond reasonable doubt. Pankey was sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole after 20 years. the statute that was in place when the offense occurred in 1984. He would be 91 years old at his earliest parole eligibility in 2042. He is serving his sentence at Arkansas Valley Correctional Facility in Ordway, Colorado, maintaining his innocence to this day. He states, "I am a Christian. I will be in heaven. I am innocent." The case that haunted Greeley for 35 years was finally solved when Jonell's remains were discovered during pipeline construction. Pankey's own statements over decades, revealing details only the perpetrator could know, became the evidence that convicted him. His obsessive insertion into the investigation, his requests for immunity, and his knowledge of the rake used to cover tracks all pointed to his guilt. The Matthews family finally got answers and justice, though it took 35 years and the accidental discovery of remains during construction work to make it possible. While Pankey was convicted despite his claims of innocence, the next case became the first to use genetic genealogy in a criminal trial. J. Cook and Tanya Van Kuylenborg. J. Roland Cook, 20 years old, and Tanya Van Kuylenborg, 18 years old, had been dating for about 6 months when they left Saanich, British Columbia, on November 18, 1987. They were taking their first overnight trip together, a quick drive to Seattle to pick up furnace parts for Jay's father's business. They took 2 ferries to reach Seattle, their ticket stamped at 10:16 p.m., excited about the adventure. They never returned home. Tanya's body was found on November 24th in a ditch near Alger, Washington. She had been harmed and struck in the back of the head with a .380 caliber bullet. Jay's body was discovered 2 days later under High Bridge near Monroe, beaten with rocks, strangled with twine, and disturbingly, a pack of Camel cigarettes stuffed down his throat. Their van was found in Bellingham with plastic gloves left inside, as if the perpetrator was taunting police with evidence. Following 3 decades, more than 200 suspects were investigated thoroughly. Biological evidence on Tanya's clothing was profiled in 1994. One of the early cases to use the new technology, and uploaded to CODIS in 2003. No match ever appeared in the database. Taunting greeting cards sent to the families from multiple cities were traced in 2010 to a mentally ill transient who was confirmed through investigation not to be the actual perpetrator. In April 2018, Detective Jim Scharf partnered with Parabon Nanolabs to try the new genetic genealogy approach. On April 11th, Parabon released a DNA phenotype composite showing what the suspect might look like based on his genetic markers. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore uploaded the DNA to GED Match, and within 2 hours, just 120 minutes, built a family tree identifying William Earl Talbot II, a 55-year-old SeaTac truck driver. Investigators surveilled Talbot carefully. On May 8th, a paper coffee cup fell from his truck during his route. The DNA matched with a probability that it belonged to someone else of 1 in 180 quadrillion, essentially impossible for it to be anyone but him. Talbot was arrested on May 17, 2018. Investigation revealed he had lived just 7 miles from where Jay's body was found in 1987. He had a documented history of disturbing behavior even as a youth, including beating a dog to its end, a red flag that often predicts violence against people. The case became historic. It was the first criminal prosecution using genetic genealogy to go to jury trial in the United States. On June 28, 2019, Talbot was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree offense. He received 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. But the legal saga wasn't over. In December 2021, Appeals court overturned the conviction due to concerns about juror bias. One juror had allegedly expressed opinions before a trial that suggested they couldn't be impartial. On December 22, 2022, the Washington State Supreme Court unanimously reinstated the verdict, ruling that defense counsel had opportunities during jury selection to dismiss the juror, but chose not to exercise those challenges. The conviction was finalized. Talbot remains at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, serving 2 consecutive life sentences. His case set the legal precedent that genetic genealogy evidence is admissible in criminal trials, opening the door for hundreds of other cold cases to be solved using the same technique. Jay and Tanya were young and in love, taking their first overnight trip together. They never made it home. 31 years later, genetic genealogy and a discarded coffee cup finally brought their families justice. C.C. Moore found the perpetrator in just 2 hours, using public genealogy databases, a search that had eluded traditional investigation for over 3 decades. While Talbot's identification came through rapid genetic genealogy work, the next case required a novel approach focusing on Italian ancestry. Lindy Sue Beichler. Lindy Sue Beichler, 19 years old, worked as a flower shop clerk and had been married about a year. On December 5, 1975, she returned to her apartment at Spring Manor in Manor Township, Pennsylvania, after grocery shopping for the week. That evening, her aunt and uncle found her deceased on the living room floor with a knife sticking out of her neck. A horrifying discovery. Lindy had been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives, including a butcher knife from her own kitchen that the attacker had grabbed during the assault. Evidence indicated an attack of a personal nature had occurred. The case became Lancaster County's oldest unsolved homicide, haunting investigators for decades. DNA from biological evidence was submitted to CODIS when the technology became available years later, but no match ever appeared in the database. In 2019, investigators released composite images of what the potential suspect might look like based on DNA phenotyping, hoping someone would recognize him. No leads materialized from those composites. In 2018, the case was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs for genetic genealogy analysis. C.C. Moore faced a unique challenge with this case. The DNA showed the suspect was fully Italian with ancestry from Gasparina, a small town in southern Italy. Traditional genealogy methods that worked for cases with diverse European ancestry weren't working here. The family trees weren't well documented in American databases. Moore took a novel approach. She researched Lancaster County historical records for immigrants from that specific Italian town. She found approximately 2,300 Italian immigrants in the area at the time of the offense. She eliminated females and those who were too old or too young to match the suspect profile. Then she researched membership cards from local Italian social clubs that listed members' birth dates and family connections. The investigation narrowed systematically through this process to David Vincent Sinopoli. On February 11, 2022, investigators collected a coffee cup Sinopoli discarded at Philadelphia International Airport, where he'd stopped during travel. The DNA matched with a probability of approximately 10 trillion to 1, essentially certain it was him. Sinopoli was arrested on July 17, 2022. At 68 or 69 years old. What made the case particularly shocking? He had lived in the same apartment building as Lindy at the time of her ending in 1975. He was her neighbor. He had been married for 36 years after the offense. His wife had absolutely no idea about his past. On October 19, 2023, Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree offense, aggravated assault, and burglary. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. In court, he said, "I would like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." The judge responded coldly, "I have seen nothing in your conduct or your words to suggest that you are truly remorseful." Sinopoli's conviction is finalized. He is serving 25 to 50 years in Pennsylvania State Prison, where he'll almost certainly pass away. Lancaster County's oldest cold case, 47 years old, was solved through a discarded coffee cup at an airport and a genealogist's creative approach to tracing Italian ancestry through social club records. Lindy's family waited nearly 5 decades for answers. They got them when genetic genealogy and traditional genealogical research combined to identify the neighbor who had been living among them in 1975. While Sinopoli's Italian ancestry required creative genealogical work, the next case involved a detective who refused to give up. Karen Stitt. Karen Stitt was 15 years old and had recently moved from Pittsburgh to Palo Alto, California, to live with her father and try for a fresh start. On September 2, 1982, she took a bus to Sunnyvale to visit her boyfriend for the evening. Around midnight, he walked her to a bus stop on El Camino Real for her trip home, a route she'd taken before without problems. The next morning, a delivery driver found Karen's body behind the Honeybee restaurant, approximately 100 yards from the bus stop where her boyfriend had left her. She was found without most clothing except for socks, her wrists bound with her own shirt. She had been stabbed 59 times, including 18 wounds to the heart. The perpetrator left his blood and biological evidence at the scene. He had cut himself during the sustained attack. DNA profiling developed in the 1990s and 2000s produced a profile from the blood he'd left behind, but no coded matches ever appeared despite years of waiting. In 2000, testing cleared Karen's boyfriend as a suspect. He'd been worried for years that police suspected him. Over 20 different detectives worked the case over the decades as it was passed from generation to generation of investigators. In 2017, Detective Matt Hutchison of the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety began investigating the case as part of his cold case assignments. Working with a genetic genealogy expert beginning in 2019, the investigation narrowed the suspect through family tree construction to one of 4 brothers from Fresno, California. In April 2022, investigators obtained a DNA sample from one of the brothers' offspring through covert collection from trash. The DNA confirmed a high probability match to Gary Gene Ramirez as the biological father of that offspring, making him the source of the DNA left at the crime scene. Ramirez, 75 years old, was arrested on August 2, 2022, in Makawao on Maui, Hawaii, where he had retired after living in multiple states over the decades. He had served in the Air Force in the early 1970s and had no prior criminal record connecting him to any offenses. He'd been living a quiet retirement in Hawaii while Karen's case remained unsolved. On February 24, 2025, Ramirez was convicted after pleading no contest to first-degree offense. On May 12, 2025, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, effectively life imprisonment, given his age of 78 years old at sentencing. Ramirez is currently incarcerated with the California Department of Corrections. Detective Hutchison was recognized for solving this case along with several others during his career, earning him the nickname Badass Detective from colleagues and a feature on ABC's 2020 television program highlighting his cold case work. Karen Stitt's family waited 43 years for justice. They got it when Detective Hutchison refused to let the case remain unsolved and used genetic genealogy to identify Gary Gene Ramirez, a man who had moved to Hawaii and thought he'd gotten away with taking a 15-year-old's life 4 decades earlier. The persistent detective, who wouldn't give up, finally brought closure to a family that had been waiting since 1982 for answers about what happened to Karen during that short walk from the bus stop. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.